All right, welcome to our fifth Serious Brandy interview. Today, I'm really happy to have Dan Farber from the Osocalis Distillery. He's coming to us live from SoCal, California, near Santa Cruz. Dan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys. It's a pleasure, actually.
So let's get started and dig in. You are I'd say a pioneer of craft distilling. How did you get started in brandy distilling?
It's interesting. So I always had an interest in wine. So I grew up, my family drank wine. My grandmother always considered herself French. Her family was French. And so I didn't really realize that at the time. But, we had wine with lunch on weekends and dinners, every night. And so at really young age, honestly, very young age, I became interested in wine. And through a series of events, I had a fellow who calls himself my West Coast dad, who really gave me a pretty good education in wine. But I always had this desire to be a little more hands-on, so I wanted to make wine. And when I looked at home winemaking, what it would take, how you would buy fruit, or what barrels were available and all this, I realized, I can't get access to the best grapes. I can't get access to the best barrels. I can't get access to anything like that. I'll just buy good wine. I can afford to do that, and I'll do something else. But so I actually started a brewery because then you could get access to, top grade malts, top grade hops. A group of us at that point, you couldn't get at, there were no yeast cultures available. People were using like bread yeast back then, but we were able to set up a lab and culture our own yeasts and get some from the American Type Culture collection that we kept. And so we had a small group of us that maintained a yeast collection, and we brewed beer. And so that was sort of where I got started, just hands-on, at least in sort of beverage alcohol production. And in the early 80s, Michael Jackson, the writer, had come in to give us a short course on Scotch malt whiskey. And in the couple of days that he spent with us, it was a weekend. It was two days, 2 sessions. And I realized that this whiskey thing sort of began where the beer left off. And I thought, dang, like nobody's doing this in the United. We should have small distilleries in the United States. Why isn't anybody doing this? And I thought, well, and this is kind of funny. I say this a lot. Like, the thought occurred to me, I'm probably an okay brewer, maybe even a good brewer, but there are so many brewers. This is like 1982 or 80. There are so many brewers that if the United States lost one decent brewer and gained an even like marginal distiller, overall it'd be a win, for the sort of beverage alcohol community. So I decided to start a distillery, and I put together a business plan. And I was really interested in that point in making what today would be called American single malt. So I had looked for sources of peat, and I found some sources of peat in Canada, and I had some sources of grain and malt, and I was going to do this. And then it occurred to me that what I really wanted to do was establish something that had the potential to express, for lack of a better term, because this is a loaded term and we could spend the whole hour talking about it, like an American terroir, like something that was truly American. And I really love Scotch. I've been passionate about it ever since, really. And I thought, but they do such a good job in Scotland. Like, they make Scotch in Scotland. And why would I do that here? I honestly, today, I think I could answer the question somewhat differently. But back then, I thought, no, it's not the right place. California is not the right place to try to produce this kind of malt whiskey that I love so much. And I thought, well, what is it that California could offer the world that might be uniquely Californian? And then I thought, fruit. And so I said, oh, well, fruit, well, that means brandy, right? And so I started to learn and travel and investigate brandy. I say the only wise business decision I ever made, frankly, was not to make eau de vie and to focus on brown spirits. And because I love eau de vie, and in another world, I usually visit Europe and eau de vie producers at least every 2 years. But I was also that part of the aging and maturation process really was exciting to me. So um, even though the fresh fruit aspects of eau de vie were also exciting, I decided I really wanted to go into brown spirits production, classic brandy production, and so we started up, and it's been that ever since. So that's really all we do, and I've never intended on doing anything else really. So
How did you end up in SoCal? Did you start there when you were doing beer, or did you find?
no, I ended up moving everything, just learning everything here when I began grad school. So I've had the distillery actually throughout my whole academic career. And
You were in Los Angeles before that? Is that?
I was in Los Angeles before that, and so we moved to an initial location in the mountain, actually very close to where our vineyards are now, vineyards and orchards. And then we moved to the present location in 1992, actually, and I've been here ever since. So. And now, and so, you know, the only thing that's really changed, well, the only things that have changed over the years are one, we now grow all our own fruit, actually where we started near Watsonville, and that thing behind me, which is a new addition, because this to my right here is an Alembic Charente, a 14 hectoliter Alembic Charente, and then that's still. So other than that, we really haven't made any changes whatsoever to, you know, what we do, or, well, you always make small changes to how you do it, hopefully, because you're learning. But
How long did it take you to get up and running from the time you had the idea till the time you were actually producing?
Well, it took there were a couple of iterations on the still, but it took 2 years back. See, there was no internet, and so I wasn't sure actually how to find. So I had decided I wanted to make brandy, and I decided that I had wanted to make it in an Alembic Charente, and so I had to find an Alembic Charente, and so there was no internet. So we started. I had a good friend of mine who lived in Paris, and so we decided to put an ad, because actually the company was founded really initially to make apple brandy, like, because I was going to make brandy, and at the time there was Hubert Germain Rabin, and there was Robert Leoté at Carneros Alembic, and they were both making great brandies. And Hubert, who was a really good friend, it still is a really good friend and a mentor. I just felt like, and it's typical, it's sort of my psyche, like, well, they're doing that, I'll just do something different. Not necessarily thinking about it in an economic way, but the Pajaro Valley here is the home of Martinelli cider. It's been there since the 1860s. It was all apples, you know, back as far back as the 40s. It's been mostly converted now over to other fruit crops. Mostly strawberries and berries. Were like one of the #1 strawberry producers and raspberry and blackberry producers around the world. But back then there was still a lot of apples, and I thought, that's what I'll do. So my friend was in Paris. We put an ad in the local Norman agricultural paper, you know, and so we got some responses to that. And I was looking around, and we were going to bring in a still, and I called the French consulate in San Francisco and asked him if there were any business contacts that he knew about. And so anyway, you know, one thing led to another, and we were able to get the first little still, which was a 6 hectoliter still. A lot of work for a little bit of brandy. So you know, there's a difference in the character of this distillate that does come from different size stills, but you know, really the sweet spot, I would say, is somewhere near, is obviously in cognac. You know, you can't do a Bon Chauffe in anything larger than a 24 hectoliter still, and they're very nice. They're 660 gallons. This is half that, like 330 gallons, which is a nice size for a small distillery. It produces about, you know, a barrel of brandy, a barrel of eau de vie per Bon Chauffe run. but the 6 hecto took 3 bon chauffes to produce 1 barrel. So that's a lot of work. So the only thing that's changed that now, over the years we got the bigger Alembic Charente and then added the Armagnac still. So that's sort of how we started up, bootstrapping really the whole way. But the thing was that when I started, the intent was always really to, hopefully anyway, because there was no guarantee. I mean, there's still really no guarantee that we do anything that's worthwhile on a worldwide basis. There are so many great distillers and distilleries out there producing brandy, especially in, sort of the mecca of at least brown spirits brandy, right, in France, one could maybe make an argument, is there a need, for more? And for me, the only need for more was if we could offer something that was of equal quality, but different in character somehow. And it wasn't really a given that would be true. And so when we founded the company, we always knew that this was a very, very, very long-term project. I mean, many decadal project, hopefully multi-generational project. Unfortunately, I see the writing on the wall closer and closer as time goes on, but we still have that view towards things, right? I mean, we just planted a traditional haute tige orchard. We started planting just 5 years ago, right? And you're talking really 20 years to see that come into fruition. So we still have that kind of very long-term philosophy. So that those early parts of the company at Osocalis, where we bootstrapped our way up, we never took risk because one, the market really wasn't there, but we were still committed to making brandy, and two, we know that we're terrible at marketing, and so we could never execute a business plan in terms of sales, the way that other companies might be able to do that. So we really just focused on production, sort of getting the word out, finding fans, where we might, and then hopefully working on producing something of quality. And now we have stocks going back 3 more decades, so then it gets interesting, actually.
What was the reaction? I mean, in the 90s, as you said, no, you and Germain Robin are the only ones really doing this. Like, what was the reaction you got when you went to, I don't know, stores or other places and said, I'm making brandy on a small scale?
Well, Hubert, like when he started, he had it worse. And actually, the guy who I said was my West Coast dad, who taught me about wine, he said it succinctly to me, like, and back then it was like $35. Why would I ever spend $35 on a bottle of California brandy when I can buy a beautiful cognac for the same amount of money? Now, he was somebody who would also drink California Cabernet, beautiful California Chardonnays at that point. But still there was this notion in the head that, that brandy produced in California was always going to be of an inherent lower quality. And he really didn't understand what Hubert was trying to do in Mendocino at that time. And he thought I was kind of nuts to actually start this project. So by the time Hubert had released a product, like we started really just on his heels. I didn't know at the time. I thought that I was going to be the first. I thought I was the first to start a brandy distillery in California, but it's like one of those things, right? Like then you get going and you find out, oh, well, no, there's actually, other people that have had the same idea. But he released, sooner than we did. He had a couple year lead time on us and more capital in the early phases, which is actually the best way to start a distillery. And so he released earlier than us. So the pushback that he got of like, who would pay this for California brandy? We didn't see so much of that. We really saw more of nobody drinks brandy. Like the market for brandy, and that's when you're talking about cognac and Armagnac and the great brandies of the world that have a reputation. When it comes to a small company producing California brandy, there's no chance we can sell this. So we would always get pretty warm receptions with respect to buyers in terms of what we were doing or what we were producing. I never really had anyone say, I've had people come into the distillery and taste and say, I knew I didn't like brandy, and spit it out, but I've never had somebody that actually liked brandy, at least to my face, say, oh, I tasted that, it was really terrible. So people liked it, but and to this day, we still have the same problems in that the market for brandy is so, let's say weak, but there are, well, like this group, right? There are people that are very, very passionate about it, but they're small. It's not like whiskey, it's not like bourbon, and the funny thing is really that there's this little bit of a catch-22, right? If something's really small and really hard to get, then there's less interest in it because it actually is really small, really hard to get, and no one knows about it. But if something has the appearance of being really small and really hard to get, it actually can attract more attention because it really is larger. So there's more people that feel like they have something that's really small and really hard to get. And we could fill in the blank of all the products I'm talking about, and no need to. So, so to our benefit, right, those who really enjoy brandy and, learn about it and investigate it, we have available to us, especially if you travel, very rare things, very old things that are made with the kind of care that you won't find in really, I would argue, any other brown spirits category today. And they're still available, actually at a reasonable price. But to the producer, that also means that we have a very small, limited, but passionate market to sell into, and that's hard.
So let's talk about your production. Let's go through the whole thing, and we'll start with the fruit. When did you acquire your vineyard, start producing your own fruit, your apples and grapes?
So we've not released anything from our own vineyards yet. We always worked with growers in different regions of California, always cool climate regions in California. That would be Monterey, Santa Cruz Mountains, Napa, Sonoma, and Mendocino, to produce fruit specifically for us for distillation, because you really have to start in the vineyard with the intent to grow fruit for distillation if you want really high quality fruit for distillation. So we have had long-term contracts with growers for many, many years. But so what we had available early on, well, really in Monterey, we had beautiful, we had, the last little bits of Colombard in Monterey County, the last little bits of Chenin Blanc that were planted there. But really in the late 80s, there was this, and early 90s especially, this transformation where all those varieties were getting ripped out and replanted with white, if it was white, Chardonnay. So slowly but surely, these old vine, 80-year-old beautiful Colombard vineyards that we were getting exceptional fruit from, like one by one, the growers were, if they wanted to replant, they didn't replant to Colombard. So we it's maybe like 15 years ago, or maybe a little less, maybe like 12 years ago, we saw the writing on the wall, right? And we're like, what are we going to do when we don't have this fruit available to us? So we actually wanted to work with growers to get them to either plant or graft over to Colombard and other varieties specifically for distillation. And we were never successful in getting growers to do that. And, while the growers we worked with really liked working with us because it's in some ways a little less risky for them to grow fruit for brandy rather than fruit for still wine, the conversations would go someplace like, oh, great, we love the project. It makes sense for us. Just, one quick question, like, if you weren't to exist in 10 years, what would the market be like for this fruit? And, honestly, I'd have to admit, like, yeah, if it's not another distillery, and there really weren't that many brandy distilleries at all that were looking for the stuff, I said, yeah, that's a good question. If I don't know really, it would not be a great market to sell into with Colombard when the market's really demanding Chardonnay. And they said, yeah, that's kind of what we thought. We're not going to. So we decided that wasn't going to work after about 5 years of attempting to get growers to work with us, and knew that we'd have to find our own place. So we decided that we would find like our own place to grow fruit that we would pick and plant. And that took about 3 or 4 years. We had a couple offers on a couple places and they didn't work. And we finally, about, I guess it's almost 4 years now, found this spot in Corralitos, and we were able to get it. Had been in apples for 150 years, but not maintained at all over the last really 30 years. So we removed much of the apple orchards that were diseased and dying anyway, and replanted it to basically 50% grapes, and it'll be ultimately 50% apple. So we've replanted about 30 acres of grapes and about 20 or so acres of apples thus far, and we're still continuing on with the apple project. But much of with the germplasm for apples wasn't here in the United States, so I actually went to Europe, and I had been in Normandy, as I said, way back when we started this whole project, and was looking at bringing in germplasm then, but I didn't have a place to put the orchards, and so.
What's germplasm?
Growing material varieties of material for making trees. So it could be, it could have been trees themselves, but that's illegal to import, or wood, which with all kinds of hoops and stuff like that is actually or can be legal to import. So I had already made the connections there, and then when we got the property here, I just kind of resurrected these old plans from the early 90s. And so we brought over, took a couple years to bring over material, and then we planted all the material out in our blocks with new material, new old material, right? No new varieties, but new collections to the United States of continental European cider varieties.
And what grapes are you growing on? What grape varietals?
So we're growing in decreasing order of like acreage. We're growing Folle Blanche, Pinot Noir, Semillon, Montiel, Folignon, one small piece of Riesling, and Viognier.
And is it your plan to eventually have all of your brandy come from the fruit that you've grown, or will you always also have some from other places?
We haven't produced any brandy off of the properties once, so we're now 100% estate. So I guess you could say that we were fortunate in the fact that the market for quality American brandy from a small company like ours was soft enough that we could take a hiatus in terms of production for a few years. So when we started planting the fruit, we were still buying grapes, and then those contracts ended, and so we went a number of years without doing any production, frankly, and now we're back ramping up production only from our own estate property.
And what was that period? When was that you didn't produce?
Up in 2 years was past. Last year we produced just a teeny weeny little bit, and so it was been the past 3 years. So it was 2 years before that. So it was harvest 18 and harvest 17.
So you're just starting back up now with your own.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you've got a couple of people have commented. You've got this great background behind you, and I know you use both the cognac and Armagnac stills. So then you've got the fruit. Tell us about your stills and your distillation process.
So everything that's on the market today is the classic double distillation process of the Charente region, right? So I guess I could go.
Yeah, show us. I know it's right there. You can tilt around. Show us your. You're still.
Hopefully this won't make anybody too sick. Let's see. So this is, do it. Yeah, that with that bright light that was on my face earlier, right? So this is the Charente still. I'm trying to look at the image. So here, ooh, it's backwards. This is like the classic pot. So we have a pear-shaped hat. So it's a direct fired still, simple hat and swan's neck. It has the middle portion, which is the chauvin, the wine preheater, and then the condenser off. Oh, it's crazy, left, right is weird here. But if I try to use my finger as a pointer, so these three parts are the most general parts of an alembic Charente. The wine preheater is not a required element, but it's an element that produces a different style of brandy if you use it or you don't use it. So as many of you know, in cognac, for instance, if you distill for Hennessy, you wouldn't have this because it's actually an expensive piece of equipment. And the Hennessy method of distillation does not utilize the chauvin. But if you distilled for Remy, then you would have it. You would be required to have it because the Remy distillation cycle actually requires the chauvin. So in the Charente, even though if we work through the basic cycle of distillation, the wine goes into the pot, it's heated up, vapor moves along this cul de sac. There's just a pipe and actually a coil that goes through the center of this and out the other side. So in fact, in your mind, the still works just perfectly fine if you, in your mind, you connect this piece with this piece back here, and then the vapor moves down into the condenser, condenses out, and goes into barrel as eau de vie. So in that first distillation cycle, the wine goes in at about, let's say, roughly 10%, usually lower, but roughly 10%. It comes out. We collect about a third of the volume of wine in something called bouillie. Bouillie then is about 27% alcohol, usually a little lower, but let's just rough number. And so we get about a third of the volume back. So we have to refill the still another 2 times to get a full volume to refill the still for the second pass, which is the bon chauffe. And in that first pass, we're collecting traditionally 3 fractions: heads, the bouillie, and then tails, although we don't always collect tails here. And then the heads and the tails are recycled back into the process to give more complexity to the final brandies. And then after 3 cycles through, we can refill the pot with the bouillie for the bon chauffe cycle, in which case we can heat this up, collect the vapor, and there we collect 4 fractions. We collect the heads, the hearts, which go into the brandy, the seconds, and the tails. Now, and only the hearts are kept for the aging process of the brandy. The other elements are redistilled. But I said that we need to make 3 fills of the still with wine before we can actually make a bon chauffe. So when we empty the still of the mar, the cooked wine left over from the distillation cycle, in fact, what we can do is we can fill the preheater with wine maybe 4 hours or so before we're going to finish this distillation cycle, and we can run. See this tube right here? I don't know how much you can see it. It bypasses around the backside of the chauvin. So early in the distillation cycle, we completely bypass the chauvin and come directly into the condenser. But with about 4 hours left, we can actually bring the vapor through the chauvin and preheat the wine for the next load of the still. And that preheating, it does save energy and it saves time a little bit on the heat up, but we don't really, that's not the reason really why we use it. The reason why we use it is because that slow cooking of the wine actually, especially when you have heavy lees, especially when you're distilling with the lees, produces a character in the brandy which is different than if you did not use it. And so it's really in cognac very much a house style as to whether you do use it or you don't use it. Here in California, we don't really have a particular house style, and so we can use it or not use it depending upon the brandy that we're trying to make. And so we have a much wider, I mean, if you took the entire palette of grapes that are legally allowed to be used in Armagnac, it's a pretty wide palette actually of grapes. And there's a pretty wide variation in the character that you get from them. But here in California, we're distilling things as highly varied as just I said, like Viognier, Pinot Noir, Riesling, Faux Blanche, Montiel, Semillon. And so we can produce different styles of brandy coming out of the Alembic Charente, not only from those varietals, but we can emphasize portions of those varietals by either utilizing the Chauvin, so we can distill in the style of Remy Martin, the style of Martell, or the style of Hennessy. We're not locked into that. So we can utilize those classic techniques to enhance some quality of the brandy that we're looking for here. So
let me ask you a couple of questions on that. You used a couple of terms I'm unfamiliar with. Bon chauffe, what is that?
The good heat. It's the name for the second distillation cycle. When you fill the still with the bouillie, the second distillation cycle is called the good heat.
And I'm familiar with heads, hearts, and tails, but you said a fourth term, seconds, is that or something?
Yeah. So in brandy distillation, the tails are quite specific. So the tails are a cut that are made typically to get the bouillie, or in this case, the seconds, into the range of alcoholic contents where the second distillation cycle can have optimal quality in the brandy. So for instance, if we have very low alcohols in the wines, if we harvest at 14 Brix or something like that, we have only 7 or 8% alcohol in the wines. If we let the distillation cycle go all the way to the end, which we always do, down to 0 degrees alcohol, or 1 degree of 1% alcohol is typically where we'll terminate the distillation cycle. If we were to let that go all the way down to the end, with those low alcohol wines, the bouillie would come out too low in alcohol for us to do a proper second distillation. So the tails are cut away from a portion of the bouillie fraction to leave that fraction higher in alcohol at an optimum level for the second pass distillation. So we take the heads, which are high in alcohol, the tails, which are low in alcohol, we recombine them, we redistill them with 1 fraction, and we take this optimal fraction of bouillie and then put that in the second distillation cycle, the bon chauffe. On the other side of that, if the wines came in very high, and we were to take the distillation cycle down to, like, if they come in really over, we don't ever want this to happen, but certainly there are many producers that I've spoken with over the years who have a sense that higher alcohol in the wine is you get more brandy. Yeah, you do. You get more brandy, but the brandy's of much lower quality. But if in a warm year, we had so much acidity and we needed to let the fruit ripen for some reason, and the grapes get up above 10% alcohol, if we were to stop the distillation cycle at 1% alcohol, we would actually have very high alcohol contents in the bouillie, above what we want. So there, you would have to do something else. So you wouldn't take a tails fraction there. You would actually probably extend the distillation to bring that bouillie down to the alcoholic level where you can get a really high quality second distillation. Or, gosh forbid, like that which is maybe another way to solve the problem, is adding water to the bouillie to bring it down. So we try to avoid that by keeping the fruit at optimum maturity, by using fruit that's grown in a place that gives optimal maturity, so we don't have either one of those problems. But the tails is not a bad fraction. As a matter of fact, it's an extremely important fraction in the character and quality of brandies that are going to go for long-term aging. So it's not like we never throw it away. We just utilize that tails fraction to optimize the fraction before it, which in one case is called bouillie on the first distillation cycle. In the other case, it's called the seconds, because we have And if I were to draw a picture of a typical distillation curve, we have, I can't do this because I'm looking at myself backwards. We have the heads, which are very high in alcohol, and then they come down, and you have this very flat section of the curve where the alcohol content is basically steady for the most part during the hearts fraction. And then just where we're going to make the cut away from the hearts, you see the sort of rapid fall in the alcoholic content, and that's where you have to start doing sensory evaluation, because that's where the cut for the seconds is going to be in the bone chauffe. And then the seconds really define the part of the distillation cycle where you get this rapid decrease in alcohol content, and then it flattens again, into the tails, where you just go for very, very, very long periods of time of collecting large volumes of material at low alcoholic volume. So the seconds get recycled back into the process. Classically, but not always, there are other classic methods. The seconds would be combined with the bruit and go straight into another bone chauffe. And the heads and the tails, you might in one of the more simplistic ways, go into the wine of the next distillation and are reincorporated that way. So we reincorporate the elements, but that's not always true, right? There are other classic types of distillation where the recombination is a little different. But anyway, so those are the classic elements. The first distillation produces heads, bruit, and tails. The second distillation produces heads, hearts, which go to the brandy, then this thing we call seconds, and then tails at the end.
Great. And now you mentioned distilling on the lees, which I gather is using spent yeast essentially. Can you describe that, and also tell us whether you do that and what the differences you see between doing it on the lees and not?
So the lees are produced during the fermentation process. So they're the yeast and other byproducts of biological fermentation. And so for instance, in your Remy Martin distillation, you always are collecting all the lees. So you'll stir the wine before putting it into the pot for distillation, so that you get back, that portion of the lees. And the lees provide fat and structure to the brandies. They give it a certain amount of heft and weight that you don't get necessarily. On the other hand, like Hennessy style distillation without the lees has a kind of elegance and I would say it also has great finesse, but in a different kind of a way. It's not as chunky a distillate. So by distilling with the lees, you really get those characters from the breakdown of those yeasts, and it's a totally different brandy. It's a completely different brandy. So here we can utilize wines where we're distilling with the lees or without the lees. So for the very, very perfumey aromatic varieties that really I only use for blending components to add some sort of specific character, like Viognier, for instance, we would distill that off the lees, because we're really looking for a very particular aromatic content. It's not really going to be the thing in the blend that's providing the structure to the brandies. And so, but with something like Colombard, for instance, we very commonly will distill on the lees to give those brandies a little bit more heft. But we also do some of that distillation off the lees to give, a kind of intensity to the brandy that you don't find. So we're not, it's the royal we here, because you're looking at the only employee that works in this facility. But we're not wedded to any one particular style. We're trying to utilize the classic techniques of cognac to achieve an expression of the fruit that we have here in California, and to put it together in a way that produces a unique style of brandy that represents really, what we have available here, the highest qualities of what we have available here in the United States.
Where did you get your still, or did you build the still? How did it come about?
No, this came from cognac. This is an antique. My other is a Mareste, oh yeah, this is, I always forget, this is a Bourbon. So this is a Bourbon. So they are not around anymore. The small one was a Mareste still. There's a Prulo out in the backyard, but it's not in use right now. There's a 24 hecto Prulo in the backyard. But so I brought this over from Cognac. It actually came from Chateau Triac. A friend, Richard Brosted, sold it to me, and so I don't. Chateau Triac is here in the United States, and it's Tiffon. It's the House of Tiffon, for those of you that know. So this still came from Chateau Triac and Tiffon.
So let's move over to you have an Armagnac still also, and you can show us how you use that, how it's different. And now you just acquired this more recently, right?
About 5 years ago, or maybe a little less than 5 years ago. So this is the Armagnac still. So the Armagnac still, actually, we have to look at the top. The Armagnac still is an absolutely unique still, as far as I know. At least let's see, at least the research, and I use that term loosely because it wouldn't have qualified in my previous life as real research, but it's something. In my research, this is an absolutely unique still. So one thing about the previous still was and this is the way I like to think about stills. I like to think of unidirectional flow stills and bidirectional flow stills. I think that's really the most insightful way to think about how stills work. The previous still, which I'd have to rotate the camera around again to show you the other side of the room, we fill the pot, and then the vapor moves up into the swan's neck, across to the condenser, down, and that's it. It only moves in one direction. When we're done with the distillation cycle, we empty the still, refill it, vapor moves in one direction. This still is a pot still, but the vapor moves in two different directions. So you see here, and in both cases, we have direct flame fired stills, and that's critically important to the character of fine, really all brown spirits for long-term aging. And even if you talk to people in Scotland, they would absolutely agree that if they had their druthers, they would be using direct fired stills. There are other reasons why many people don't. But in brandy distillation, we still do, for the most part, use direct fired stills. In most cases required by law in Cognac and Armagnac. So, but here, this pot is direct fired. If I show, it's actually split in two pieces right here, and I'll try to point out what that is. So I'm gonna try to do this. It's a little tricky, if you will. So you're gonna have to kind of, and I'll ask you, if I'm not clear with this, and if you don't understand it, ask questions, because it's easier for me to explain knowing what the complication may be, rather than me just say, oh yeah, I explained it perfectly. So let's start over on this side. And to understand how this still works, you kind of have to start on one side, get to the other side, and go all the way back again. So we'll start on this side. I was gonna bring my pointer. Let's see what we've got. This'll do. Broom handle. So this piece up here, I don't know, can you see?
Yes.
This piece up here is, well, I'm actually going to start down here. This piece down here is called the condenser. And what we have is we have a series of valves, which you can't see there. They're off to the side here. There's a series of valves there, and there's actually a tank up on top above this thing that you can't see because it's up on the roof. And it has a gravity feed down to those series of valves over here. And those valves then allow the wine, which is up in that tank, to gravity feed down, let's see if I can, into here. And I feed the wine by gravity into the bottom of this condenser. And as I feed the wine into the bottom of this condenser, the cold wine now, and there's a coil inside here. The cold wine moves up. The cold wine moves around here. This is just a spacer, just to get the height right. And probably something else too, but that's a little thermodynamic detail that's I'll tell you about it if you're interested. The wine moves up through this pipe. It moves up into here, which is called the preheater. There's another coil in there, and then it displaces up, and then it moves along that bottom pipe up here. Can you see?
Yep.
It moves along this bottom pipe where it comes into the column, and you see in the column, each one of these represents a bubble plate level. And I could maybe show you what that looks like with the camera, but most people I think would know what bubble trays look like. And so the wine now, which has been preheated, starts to fall down these bubble trays, opposite directions, opposite directions, opposite directions, opposite directions. It falls into this, which is actually a very large bubble tray. And the reason why is because the relative ratio of the surface area to one of these smaller bubble trays to the surface area of this large bubble tray gives a long residence time to the liquid at this level. So and that becomes important. Then from this bubble tray, it falls down one more level into the pot, where there's a direct flame fire on the bottom of the pot, which boils that liquid, producing vapor moving up through these bubble trays. Oh, I just got it. Moving up through the bubble trays, the vapor goes up through the bubble trays, up to that top pipe, comes across as vapor into the coil, which is in the preheater, comes around the preheater into the condenser, and then condenses out as brandy here. And that process is continuous. So we're bringing in cold wine from the top continuously. It's moving into the bottom of the condenser, up to the preheater, across to the top of the column, down the column, into the wide bubble tray, down into the pot, and the vapor's going up. And this pot overflows just ever so slightly at the same rate as we let the wine into the condenser. So it's a continuous process of distillation. It's a continuous pot still distillate. So it's bidirectional flow, but it's a pot still because it has a direct flame fire on a pot down below. In my mind, column stills are like classic coffee column stills that you might find in Kentucky, where the column has steam moving up from the bottom, pure steam coming from a steam generator, and the feed is fed into the column and it falls down, and then the vapor moves up the column. That's a pure column still. An Armagnac still is not a pure column still. It's really a pot still with a column still hooked into it. So it's very, very unique. There are other aspects of the Armagnac still which make it unique as well, and I'll try to point them out here. So it's probably easier for me to do. Now, if you typically look at a coffee column still, if we were to sort of remove this pot, like cut it off right here and just blow steam in the bottom of it, right? And it might be a little bit longer, but it need not be for this thought experiment. The feed would come in typically at about 1/3 of the height of the column. So you would feed here and you'd have the bidirectional flow section just here. So you'd have steam moving up and your feed moving down. So that's the bidirectional flow section of the still. And then above where your feed comes in is a unidirectional flow part of a column still. So coffee column still has a bidirectional flow lower, let's call it 1/3. It varies greatly by still to still, but it's in its most general form, let's say like about 1/3 of the column is bidirectional flow, 2/3 of the column, which we call the rectification part of the column, are unidirectional flow up and over. Well, the Armagnac still, this column is bidirectional flow all the way up to here, right? Because this is the point where the feedstock is coming in, and this is the point where the vapor is coming out. So the only part of this still, which is rectification, is like 10 inches out of almost 10 feet. And so what that means is that the vapor is interacting with wine at some degree of let's call it, for in its simplistic sense, right, de-alcoholized wine as it moves down the column. And that's really just a marker, because the alcohol is not the important part here. And so the only part that rectifies is just this part. So the vapor is becoming more and more alcohol rich as you move up this column, because the column's cooling and the vapors, it's distilling up through these sets of bubble plates. And so the most rectified vapor interacts with the least modified wine right here. And then you only have this little itty bitty section of rectification above it. And what that means is that you have this inner fingering of the alcoholic vapor and this just pure wine right here. And so that vapor always pulls out a piece of the raw wine that goes directly into the distillate, because you really don't have any rectification above it. And then that comes over, is condensed down, is preheated, and the cycle continues. So the Armagnac still, which actually predates the coffee still in terms of its patent, is this very, very unique configuration. And those elements are the elements that are common to all Armagnac stills is the split preheater condenser, the column with a very small rectification piece, and then this wide bubble tray. And what that does is it means that as the wine falls down here at some rate, click, 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 here it lasts about 5 to 8 times longer. And so the vapor that bubbles through there from the pot below it really has time to interact and remove all the aromatic components from the wine at this large bubble tray level before it moves up into the column. So that's a bit about the Armagnac still. And honestly, there are characters to the Armagnac, so there are very particular characters to Armagnac stills. The eau de vie come from them, the brandies that are derived upon aging those eau de vie. I love Armagnac, and so the interesting thing is that this still not only is used in Armagnac, but it's also used in regions of the Calvados. And so I'm not very partial to kind of gimmicky things in the spirits world, and I can think of a lot of offerings today which I would consider to be more gimmicky than quality. And so we don't have a lot of SKUs out in the marketplace, because I spend most of my time in the vineyard, then distillation, then blending, and then I find it interesting. The variation from barrel to barrel I find curious, but usually never something that I want to personally partake in drinking. It's fun to see in the shea, but by blending things together, I always get a much more satisfying brandy than just a simple single barrel. So I'm not very partial to single barrel releases, but there are, in some cases, clients we have who would like to see more releases from our distillery rather than just the 4 that we have today. And this addition to the still did 2 things. One is it allows me to still do all the distillation here myself without any help, which is a benefit to our company, especially in these times. And it allows me to produce really classic brandies stylistically, let's say, or rooted stylistically, but from both apple and grape, because in Calvados, this still is used in the is allowed to be used and is commonly used in the Dom Fontas, and the Alembic Charentais is required to be used in the Pédoge, and in Cognac, the Alembic Charentais is required to be used, and in Armagnac, this still is more commonly used, although you also can use an Alembic Charentais in Armagnac. There are a few producers like Janot that do both. So it allows us to actually utilize both the classic tools to produce a range of offerings in the future, but not, I would say, hopefully not gimmicky offerings.
So are you distilling grapes and apples on both stills?
Yes.
And I just want to go back to your description because you mentioned the bubble trays, and I'm not sure everyone knows what that is. So can you just?
I wonder if I can take you over there and show you what that is.
Yes, take this on a field trip.
Yeah, let's see if I can do this. I gotta look in here and I gotta shine this. This is pretty interesting. If you guys don't get completely bored by this, you are better people than I. So can you see in there now?
Yep.
So those are, I'm sorry to get those are bubble caps. So what happens in that tray is, can you see those little scallops on the bottom of the caps?
Yes.
So what happens is the vapor, there's a tube that cap covers up, and the vapor moves up that tube from below and then is forced down, and that tray, when we're running it, would be filled with liquid. You can almost see the line. I don't have another hand. You can almost see the line on the bubble cap that is the liquid level. And so literally in those scallops, the vapor bubbles through the liquid when it's in that tray. And that bubbling is what actually rectifies. I don't know if you see, there's a big one in there, but
too much glare on that one.
Yeah. So the bubble caps are a way of rectifying the spirit up. And so in each one of those, so the reason why that there's a little bit of liquid in that tray is because the overflow, the tube that allows overflow from the tray, is raised just a little bit above the height of the tray. So you have to have a little liquid, and then it can flow over and down into the next tray below. And actually those overflow pipes, if you will, they alternate from side to side to side to side. So it's kind of a zigzag pattern that the liquid has to take on its way down. So the vapor's bubbling up through them, and it condenses a little bit on each tray, produces a little bit more liquid that overflows to the tray down below. And since the tray down below has less alcohol in it, the boiling point, the vaporization point, is higher down here than it is up here. And so there's actually a temperature gradient in this column. And that's kind of really the art of running this still. And it's actually a lot trickier than it might seem, because what you want in this still is you want to keep the gradient in this column constant. You want the preheater to be preheating at a set temperature for you. You want the condenser always to be condensing at the right temperature for the distillate. And that's all controlled by the flow rate going into this, into the still. So you have to control the flow rate and the burner rate very delicately. And even just a storm coming through will change the atmospheric pressure enough that you'll see it. Now this, to my knowledge, is the first Armagnac still that actually is semi-automated. So we have this thing down here, which is a Coriolis force flow meter. It's a simultaneous densitometer, and it gives us also flow rates and temperature. So it utilizes the Coriolis force to be able to tell us simultaneously what the density is and what the flow rate is. So I can monitor in real time the flow rate coming out of the still, the alcoholic content. I've actually written the code for us to convert it density to alcohol content. And so we can monitor that continuously. And then we have a set of valves that are automated here that I can set the flow rate at very precisely. So it keeps very precise flow rates. I can monitor that, and we have temperature sensors. Although we have the analog dial indicators, because frankly, that's what I like to look at when I'm in the distillery. Everything is actually controlled by a computer. The old way to do it would just be ball valves, like very carefully turning a ball valve. But you can do it, you can get that with a lot of practice. You can get that pretty well, but you can't really keep it constant. So even if a little front comes through, it rejuggles the whole still, and you see these kind of waves go through. Whereas now we can set that flow rate, we can control the burner, and we can keep the column where we want it in terms of the temperature distribution based on those factors. So it's not fully automated in the sense that there's no feedback, to say like, oh, it would be better to do the distillation in this way or this way or the other way. I just get to set the flow rates I want and they stay constant. I set the burner rates I want, they stay constant, and we can monitor everything and adjust them accordingly. And the Charente still here is also automated in the sense that we have feedback between the burner and the distillate coming out on the other side. So we can program in what we want those distillation cycles to look like very precisely. In the old days, like I don't even have it anymore, we would have to do that by hand every couple of minutes, adjusting the burner by hand. Or even before that, you know, not me, because I never had a wood-fired still, but it was used to be, you'd have to keep firing wood up and up and up to get because in this one, the boiling point, it's steady state. So once everything's steady state, in theory, nothing should change. In the Charente still, in the unidirectional flow pot stills that are not steady state, that are batch distillation process, when the vapor first comes off the still, the boiling point is lower. But now that we've removed some alcohol, what's left in the pot is lower in alcohol, and the boiling point moves up. So the temperature is constantly changing in the Charente still, and we can program what we want that to look like.
So how, and by the way, does this still come from Armagnac?
Yeah, this is produced in Condom, yeah.
So how do you utilize these different stills for different wines and ciders, and then how do you choose what to use in the still, what to use in the Armagnac still, and then how do you blend those?
So, well, as I said, you know, they're really used right now to produce two different products. So the Armagnac still is producing Armagnac, I don't want to say Armagnac style because it really sounds like a copy. And we're not, you know, we're not trying to copy Armagnac. We're trying to be informed by Armagnac, to understand the quality aspects of a great Armagnac, and to try to achieve the same quality aspects with fruit here that also somehow expresses both our fruit and our climate and our climatology here. So, but I'll just use the sort of placeholder term, if you will, just it's easier to talk about, like Armagnac style, let's say. So this is used to produce an Armagnac style brandy and a Dom Frontas style apple brandy. And those, you know, then are going and they're aging separately. And the Charente still is going and producing Charente style brandies, and those are being aged, or Pays d'Auge like apple brandies, and those are being aged separately. And I haven't yet cross-blended any of those, so I don't really have any, and I don't have plans at the moment to produce any sort of hybrid style brandies, which would be either in apple or grape, a blend of the two different still types. Not that I'm averse to that over the long haul, but just that I feel like I haven't really cut my teeth yet on just the basic styles of brandies coming out of the stills, you know, and I don't really feel I have a deep enough understanding for how they develop and how they might go together to start to put those kinds of blends together yet. I mean, in the future, that's quite possible, but I think we need a little more learning before.
So is all your brandy on the market today made in the pot still?
Yes, they're both pot stills. It's made in the Charente still.
That's a discussion we had earlier when you corrected me that you don't think it's correct to say, as is commonly said, that Cognac is pot still and Armagnac is column still.
That's right.
I don't. Rectifier, right?
That's definitely a pot still. There's the pot right there.
So do you have plans then for, these are going to be new or different expressions?
Yes.
In the Armagnac or the Dom Frontas style?
Yes, yes.
Are you using pears at all, just since you mentioned Dom Frontas?
No, there's a couple reasons why. Traditionally, the reason why is that the only pear that's really available, not the only one, but that was available on the commercial market here was pear Williams, right? And so we did, and it comes in the summertime, like August, And that's the time of year where we're really busy in the vineyard. And so, it came at the wrong time for us. So now, Perry pears, or the cider pears, I've tried to grow cider pears here for years, like no decades, on an experimental basis, and they are super susceptible to fire blight. And everything we do in our vineyards is organic, and actually we use biodynamic practices for the most part. And back then, there really wasn't effective organic control of fire blight, and it wipes out Perry pear trees. I mean, it's unbelievable how susceptible they are. I have them on. I have a Bartlett, a Poire William Bartlett, and a Perry pears on the same tree, and I've regrafted that 10 times over the years. And the Bartlett makes it, even with a little bit of fire blight. It's susceptible, but it still lives. The Perry pears just completely died. So we have not actually utilized cider pears in our ciders. So our ciders are kind of funny in that way, because you're right, even though we're using now this style still, which would be Dom Frontas light without the pear, it's certainly, well, first of all, it could never be Dom Frontas because we're here in California. But even if you tried to sort of, build up that kind of style thing, it wouldn't be the same, because it's 100% apple. Now in Pédoge, it's 100% apple coming off of the Charente still. So you might say, it's more similar. But our style, apple brandy, is different here because our climate is different, really. So interestingly enough, and this may evolve over time, over the past, what we've had access to commercially here, what pretty much what everyone has access to commercially in the United States, if you're not growing your own fruit, is sharps. So there's 4 classes of apples. There's sharps and sweets, and bitter sharps and bitter sweets. And so those are classified based on the level of malic acid, that's the tart acid of apple, and tannins in the apple. So a sharp is an apple that is high in acid, relatively low in sugar. A sweet is an apple that is really high in sugar, and most of them are basically devoid of any acid. And it's very rare that you've ever tasted a sweet apple. Even things like Golden Delicious, I classify as like weak sharps. They still have enough acidity to balance the sugar to where the fruit tastes fresh. But a real true sweet variety, if you go to Calvados and you taste them, when you bite into them, it's a very strange sensation, because it smells like an apple and it tastes like an apple, and you have this sense that it's going to feel like an apple when you eat it, but it's got no acidity. So it's almost like carrot juice, right? You know how the first time you ever drank carrot juice, it was off-putting because there's just no acidity and very sugary. I remember the first time I tasted it, it was very off-putting. Well, of course, I developed a taste for it later, but so that would be a sweet apple. And then you have the bitter sharps and the bitter sweet. So those are high tannin, high sugar, and high tannin, high malic acid apples. In the United States, pretty much, really, the only apples that are grown are sharps. And so not all, because today there are some small amounts of orchards, early on in I guess it was early 90s that Steve at Poverty Lane Orchards brought back, some British cider varieties producing, ciders. And now there are some small producers using more classic bitter sharps and bitter sweets for ciders. But the major, on continental ciders, both British and French ciders are made from predominantly bitter sharps and bitter sweets, with small amounts of sweets and sharps added to give them balance. Here in the United States, most all cider producers were producing from sharps, ourselves included. A range of sharps, but still sharps all the same. And there's one place in the world where traditional ciders are made solely from sharp apples, and that's in Spain, both in the Pays Basque and in Asturias, especially Asturias. And there, the ciders have a very, very different character. And all our fermentations here are done native. So both for the apples and for the grapes, it's all wild native fermentations, and has been for decades now. Early on, we played around with a range of different yeasts. when we were producing cider for Germain Rabanne, we also were using cultured yeasts then. But since that project was over for decades, we're back to 100% native fermentations. And if you take our fruit that's available locally and regionally and you ferment it natively, you produce a cider that's a dead ringer for Sidra Natural de Asturias. I mean, honestly, my daughter, when she was in grade school, her close friend's mother's Basque, and every summer, her mother, my daughter's friend's grandmother would come over to visit in the summertime. And she would always come and get 2 cases of cider because she said those was exactly what they drank at home. And I hadn't, when my daughter was young, I had never spent much time in that region of the world. So I didn't really know what she was talking about. But later on, I went and spent time there, numerous times there. And sure enough, like our native ciders here are kind of dead ringers for the ciders there. But the production processes of our brandy and the aging of our brandy is much more informed by my experience in France. And so our apple brandy is sort of this, you could call it a bastard, or you could call it unique, or you could put whatever label you want on it. But it reflects both of those characteristics. It reflects a character of the ciders that is more Spanish-like, and a production and aging sensibility that's more French-like. And today, what we're growing on our property are bitter sharps, bitter sweets, and sweets only, no sharps. I think I have one that I brought over. Because we have available high quality sharps here in the United States that if we needed to supplement our apple fruit, we would be able to do it. So we're growing only bitter sharps, bitter sweets, and sweets. And it very well may be that in the future, you know, the style of brandy that we produce from them changes over time as those fruits come into maturity and things change. So, but after the distillation, you know, the whole world of maturation really begins.
Before you go there, I want to ask one more question about the stills.
Sure.
So you take a wine and a cider, and say you take the same wine and same cider, distill once in the alembic, once in the Armagnac style, I won't say column,
Yep.
Or the same cider. What are the differences going to be in those 2 brandies that are produced?
Okay, fair enough. We always in the Charente still have to distill twice. So this one, it's once, right? Because it's just one pass through, and you get, let's say, between 55, wherever you want it, right? Between 55 and you can get as high as 68% in this still if you wanted it, but we usually are at the lower end. But so there's the difference in the style of the Charente still produces a distillate with great finesse and great structure and a certain elegance that you find really, I don't think you find in any other spirits around the world. And I'm a whiskey fan. But brandies produced on the Charente still have this elegance and finesse that is really unique among the brown spirits. The Armagnac still produces a very hefty spirit that really speaks to the fruit that it came from, and has this vinous character because of that continuous interaction between the vapor and the wine, and always has this really shouldery robustness that you really smell and sense the grapes and the earth that it came from. You know, I will say, and it might be, I love both. I really do. I can honestly say that wholeheartedly. I love both of the traditions. You know, I think in many cases I'm a little. No, I won't bias it. I won't bias it. But everybody might have a preference, you know, and sometimes it's just on a particular night. Sometimes it's just.
Give us your opinion, Dan. Don't shy away. So don't shy away from giving us your opinion, Dan.
No, I love the rusticness of Armagnac, you know, and it goes well, you know, with the rustic cuisine of Gascony, you know, and it just is fitting. You know, we don't have so much of that in the United States, where we have products that have evolved over time in a place with a cuisine, and with a kind of reflection on the countryside and the people that make it. We don't, I mean, certainly I think the bourbon tradition reflects on aspects of that, but I don't think it's as well developed in terms of its interrelationship with the cuisine and the traditions of cooking and farming that you would find in France. That just been my experience. I might be lacking in some cases, but that's been my experience. So the Armagnac still produces this very bold, rustic spirit that can be beautiful. That is beautiful, and then the maturation of that spirit when it goes into Gascon oak too, which is a very bold, very tannic, oak, can produce just a beastie spirit, and sometimes it lacks a little bit in the elegance, what it lacks in elegance and finesse that the Charente still produces, it makes up for in its boldness and direct connection to the wines that it came from. Whereas the Charente still produces spirits that are, they're much more refined, and they certainly carry over the character of the grapes that they came from, but not in that vinous way, not in that rustic, earthy way, in a much more refined, elegant way that some might say loses a little bit of the character that comes from the Armagnac still, and others might say really refines and brings elegance and structure to the brandies that come from it. So those are really the two main differences.
So let's talk about maturation. What wood are you using? What's your maturation process for your brandies?
So about almost 10 years ago. So I wanted this project to be 100% American. So I started, when we started, we used a range of oaks, predominantly, well, not predominantly, but we used a quite large amount, high percentage of American oak barrels. And we went through many, many, many American oak producers, different origins, different places where the oak was aged, different coopers. But we're never really satisfied with any of the results that we got in American oak. I always say, like, American oak wants to make bourbon. It just wants to make bourbon. And while I love it in some things, I love it in Bordelais variety wines, for instance. Don't love it, let's say, in Pinot wines as much, if at all. French oak really does such a nice job with fruit that we moved over 100% to French oak very, very early on, maybe within 7 years. The American oak tends to sit on top of the fruit, and that bourbon vanilla and all the lactones, the coconut and the banana, and they tend to hold the fruit down a little bit and kind of impose their own will on the maturation of the brandies. Whereas French oak, which has, and the other thing about French oak is that it actually contains tannin. I mean, there's you can measure tannin in American oak, but it's vanishingly small in Quercus alba. French oak, both Quercus petrea and Quercus robur, but especially the latter, have a high degree of tannin, and that tannin gives structure to the brandies that are aged in them. And the character of French oak tends to be more supportive of the fruit and kind of let the fruit express itself on top. So today we're 100% French oak. We source from a number of different forests, and about it's almost going on 10 years ago, we started a program by which we now source with colleagues in France our own stave wood, and we age our own stave wood in Jarnac, outside of Jarnac, and then we have our own stave wood coopered by coopers, typically a range of coopers, because I like to see a range of styles coming in the barrels. It gives more complexity to the brandies rather than having just one cooper. But I mean, that could be interesting too. Like, if you like the style of a brandy produced by, like, so instance, at least in the past, and I think it's still true now that Gallo has Germain Raban, actually the head distiller there is a good friend. I just have never asked him this question. but traditionally Germain Rabanne was 100% Vicard barrels, and it's very classic. I love it. They're great. They're super high quality barrels, but it gives a very classic.
Sorry, what kind of barrels were they?
From Vicard, the producers Vicard, and they were 100% Vicard, and so it has that. If you taste it, you'd know it. I mean, yeah. And so for here we use a range of different coopers. Have over the past and still do. Way back when we were buying directly from those coopers, using their wood, but it turned out that at one point I wanted certain coopers to sign a contract saying that the wood would be of a specific forest origin, and they wouldn't do it. They said, no. So I wanted Limousin. Limousin is Quercus robar. It's pedunculate oak, or English oak if it's in England or here, and has a very different structure to it than sessile oak or Quercus petrea, which is more center of France oak, which is more sought after for wine in most cases. Although Martel is 100% Quercus petrea sessile oak. We could talk about that in a second. But I wanted Limousin. And so I asked a couple producers if they would sign a contract stating that what we were getting was Limousin. So the barrels were always stamped with an L. So I just figured, no problem. I just wanted to make sure we were getting Quercus robar. I said, will you just write the contract saying Quercus robar from the Limousin forest? I said, no, we won't do that. What we do is we make Limousin style barrels, meaning wide grain, but it can come from a number of different places. I was like, what? No, there's a big difference between these oak types, and and it wasn't really that I was disappointed in any way with what we were getting out of those barrels. I have some projects I'm working on elsewhere where we're looking at using some of those producers again in their stock barrels. But I was interested in understanding the characteristics of brandies that come from specific forest origins. And so we said, okay, we can't do this because no one will guarantee it anymore. So it turned out through a series of events, I knew some people who were just starting up a new company, and they specialize in sourcing wood from particular forests. And so we started to work with them. So now we maintain our own supply of stave wood from a range of different forests. So we do mostly Quercus robar from Limousin, but we also have some Monzaloon oak from Gascony, the Pyrenees. We have a bit of Tronchet wood, Quercus petrea from the center of France. And we have one small lot still of Vosges, Quercus robar, but from Vosges, the other side of France. And so every year we're buying more stave wood. We're aging that 3 years, typically, almost always 3 years outside in Jarnac, then having the barrels coopered in Jarnac, then bringing them over, and then they go here and we use them here.
And what size barrels are you using?
All 350 and 400 liter barrels.
And so do you start in new oak and transfer? What's your cask management?
Yes, we start in new oak and then we transfer, usually on the first fill within about 6 or 8 months. It'll go from there into neutral wood, and from neutral wood to older and older and older wood as those brandies and those blends mature. And so, the barrel has something like 5 to 6 years of, let's say, a useful lifetime in terms of imparting oak character to the brandy. So the first fill may be 8 months, the second fill may be a year plus, and the third fill, maybe can go the remainder, right? And then those barrels stay as the stock is building here. We don't really get rid of any barrels because we need those vessels they become neutral, and then they're rotated into the younger neutral program as the new wood is coming in. We're about, I would say, 50% new oak. I don't like to see too much oak on the brandies, but that can vary really depending upon the character of the wood from that particular year or that particular forest, but something like that.
And do you add brandy to barrels or water to barrels as you go?
We sometimes do that, yes. More commonly, we'll start to put together large blends, large coops. And so we'll go back with a blending vat. And so we'll dump the barrels into the blending vat, do a small dilution, and then back into barrel for further aging. So that dilution process is very slow. It takes typically, for our rare, which is a minimum of 4 years old, it takes really all of 4 years to make that dilution. And for the XO, which is typically like a minimum of 14 years old, it takes, basically, it takes really, well, it takes all of 14 years, like, because the last dilution, which is done with Feb or Petiot, is done at the very end. But we will always age the brandies for an extended period of time at very low proof. So for the XO, you're seeing the aging of that brandy at low proof for many, many years before we actually go to bottle. And that's, brandy is all about complexity, right? It's all about really getting a spirit which has a very long profile in the nose and in the mouth. It's about motion and change, in the palate, and to really develop the most complexity in the spirits. The aging process, the techniques of aging, it's really a process, right? It's not just, because you already asked some intelligent and very pointed questions, but it's not just putting, the spirit in a barrel, sealing the bung, setting the timer, and coming back in 10, 12, 30, 50 years and seeing, what happened. We're constantly working with those brandies to develop the maximum potential that they can achieve, right? It's like, so yeah, I always say, like, the French use the term élevage, right? To raise, like, you do that with cows, you do that with your kids, really, you don't just like throw your kids out there and just hope that, they come back when they're 21 and they're perfect, right? You're nurturing them, and then that's the same way that we work with brandies. We're nurturing them through their maturation process the whole way. And so, part of that is this slow dilution, this constant blending, and then the moving of the brandies into older and older blends as time goes on, and utilizing older and older wood. So I always say that our most valuable parts of our wood program are both the new oak program that we have, and then our oldest oak that's in the shade. Now, those are barrels that go back almost 100 years, because when I started, I brought over old cognac barrels from cognac to start that old maturation cycle. And so, now we've had them decades, and they were, so we have some going back to, almost 100 years old now. And that's not old, right? By cognac standards, that's nothing. Remy in the Louis XIII has wood going back hundreds of years old. So those old, right, the Louis XIII, they're selecting only the best of the Grand Champagne at 60 years old to begin maturation in the Louis XIII, right? To begin maturation at 60 years of age. We don't really have anything like that in the United States yet, and we may never, actually. We don't know. I mean, in a dream, I'd like to think that there's potential to grow vineyards and produce eau de vie that have that capability of aging. But even in cognac, it's not every region that has that potential to age. It doesn't mean that it's lower quality, right? As a matter of fact, for me, if you're drinking Grand Champagne younger than 40 years, you're kind of missing the point. I much prefer a beautifully harmonious Bombois or Bordeaux, at 25 or 35 years, which can actually, some of those can be in their peak. The Grand Champagne doesn't even show why we consider it to be the greatest of the grapes, the greatest of the greats, until really it hits its stride at 45 and older. And so, and here in the United States, we just don't have, frankly, that stockage and tradition of finely made brandies going back that far. So we don't know. We're changing the way we make brandy here. The varieties of grapes that we've planted in our own vineyards are different than many of the varieties we've used in the past. We limited the number of grapes. The blends that we have now have a much wider variety of grapes in them that we will in the future. So it's an ongoing process to see what really California has to offer in the next couple hundred years. Long after I'm gone.
So for the brandy that goes into, say, something like the XO, how many different casks will one brandy see before it gets bottled?
Good question. The XO will commonly see something like 4. So for instance, in the first year of maturation, it's really all about extraction. It's extractive, right? Where the young eau de vie, which is very fruity and very floral, it goes into a young barrel, which is really aggressive and very firm. And it's almost as if they're fighting for the first year. And for sure, the barrel wins. Every time the barrel wins. At the end of the first year, the fruit is gone. The brandy is tannic, the over oaked, if you will, for that moment, and just terrible, really, not very pleasant to drink. And during the second year, there's still sort of the second year, they're fighting, but they're together in one house, and they know that the wood and the fruit are just going to have to. This is going to be a marriage, By the end of the second year, they're pretty much married, and you have something that is just beginning to come out of this funky phase, and you have the sense of like one product. It's not like wood and fruit, still together. They've really knit together, and it's not very exciting yet, but at least you see we've made progress. And that's the point at which we would begin the first sets of blends. Really is year 2. We'll pull things, we'll put that into a blend. So that would go, depending upon the barrel, it'll come into the blending barrel, and then it would maybe go into a different barrel, especially if it came from a very active barrel. It's going back into a neutral barrel now. And then for the XO, especially, like we would let those go another 2 years to where we have 4-year-old brandies, and now we're really starting to see the development. We would be actually in year 3, we would, depends on how long those brandies are going to go, but like we would start to bring them down in alcoholic content, and they would be reblended commonly every couple of years, and then go back in barrel, and then finally they get to at 14 years old. Typically, it can vary, because if I have a beautiful barrel that I want in the XO blend and it's 12 years old, it may end up there because I just like it. On the other hand, many of the barrels are older than 14. So we don't really keep track of. We do keep track of the minimum age, but we don't really say it on the label because it's more about the style of brandy that we're producing rather than the age. It's just like. Right? It's just, we all know people, right? Some people mature faster, some people mature slower. They all get to the same place. So we really want the blend to reflect a state of maturity and a style rather than a rigid age. Now, there is some niceties to vintage aged brandies. It's classic in Armagnac to have some vintage age, because birthdays and, weddings and celebrations, just marking that year. And also in some cases, just to sort of have a reference of how the climate, may have affected brandies from like a particular thing every year. That's interesting too. But, for me, I love very much the art of blending and putting together things that express a kind of a sensibility of how we want the brandies to be, rather than having a rigid, bottling at 14 years. So there might be something about 4 or 5 times you might see those change barrel over the time. And finally, when they go into the final XO blend, they're usually down around 42%. And then those are in the very old casks that only contain the XO blend. And that's all that ever goes in those casks. I don't see anything else. Because, part of the aging process, and it's one of the more frustrating ones, it's not frustrating anymore. Like my pottery teacher actually taught me this. Maybe it wasn't good because I picked up on it maybe more than I should have. I'd always throw a bowl, and he would come over to the potter's wheel and say, yeah, let's take a look at that. And he'd take the wire and just slice the bowl in half, right on the potter's wheel. What the heck are you doing? Like, that was supposed to go in the firing. I needed some bowls. That was part of it. It's like, Dad, let's look at the foot. Let's look at the rim. It's a little thin here. Your throwing needs a little improvement here. And I'm like, okay, but I just worked so hard on that bowl and now I don't have the bowl anymore. And he said, if you're going to really do well with this pottery thing, like the one thing you should remember, which was he was taught in Japan, he was Japanese trained, is that if you're going to fall in love with something, fall in love with the process. Don't fall in love with the product. You'll never be happy if you fall in love with the product. You'll always be happy if you enjoy the process. And I just thought, yeah, but you know what? You just totally screwed up that bowl. And I really love that bowl. And you can go off with your philosophy and find it. But somehow over the years, that really resonated with me. And so now, I really, really do just love the process. So if I was thinking all the time about the fact that I'm going to die before I see full maturity of any of the things I've made, or that, it would just be, you wouldn't sleep at night. Not that we do anyway these days, but just enjoying the process. And so here I was going to say one of the more frustrating things, but one of the things that one has to be more patient for is that the maturation process of brandies also involves the maturation process of the wood, which involves the maturation process of the room. So you can't really make Ronciode brandies in a cement tilt up or a metal, warehouse in, downtown someplace, because the building doesn't have the character to age brandies. Like the actual space that those barrels occupy is living. It's microorganisms, both flora and fauna and things in between, frankly, that actually give rise to those characteristics which we call rancio in many cases. And so you have to wait patiently for the wood to age, for the building to age, for all that environment to sort of come into its own to really be able to express true rancio of the region. And so honestly, like, our rooms are just now, after 3 decades or more, starting to have that sense. But it's not like I'm walking into a 200-year-old Shea in Cognac someplace where you really have that well developed characteristic, and it's nurtured, it's taken care of, and people understand it there, that's also part of the character that gives those brandies such great uniqueness. And in Armagnac too, you'll see it in both places, really. So here we're still in that process of maturing our buildings, maturing our wood, maturing our brandies. So the style of brandy that we produce today, in some cases, reflects more of this very floral, fruity character that we get here. But some of our older brandies now really are starting to express, a good sense of rancio from California, and that, you have to go really more than 15 years really to start to really see that. Definitely, you have to go more than 15 years to start to see that really develop. So in our XO, in our heritage, the heritage, which is really kind of aimed at bottling something that expresses like real rancio, and the XO is blended to have both of those well rancioed elements, but still these sort of very fruity floral characteristics of a mature but not intensely rancioed brandy. So that's all part of the process.
What are the oldest brandies going into those, the Heritage and the XO?
The Heritage is going on 25 years now, I think, and the XO is getting up to like 21. I'd have to. It's a funny thing though, right? Like in the blend, like when I pop it in, like if I keep track of that element, it would be like because they're modified Solera processes, right? And so so if you keep track of the oldest element, it's like still always getting older, but how much is absolutely left in the blend? In theory, you could do the dilution calculation and find out, how much is still left in the blend. Frankly, I don't do that kind of bookkeeping, but we do know the oldest barrels that are still in that blend, and we do know the youngest barrels for absolutely that are in the blend. That we know every year because we only blend in after it gets to let's say between 12 and 14 years, usually 14. It only goes into the XO at 14. So but that upper limit is kind of ethereal, right? Because you're removing a small piece of the blend every year for bottling, reblending, right? And then it's in there. So so this modified Solera, eventually I could say, oh, it's 100 years old, started in 1859 or something. But how much of that's left? But the interesting thing is that the character of the blend is evolving, even if there's only one molecule of the original barrel that was 14 when we started it, and that's 30 years ago, so now it's 44 years old, right? Well, how much of that barrel is still left in the blend? That's really not necessarily the important aspect of it. The important aspect of it is that that blend has been maturing together for that period of time, and so it's slowly getting more character and more character and more character as time goes on. Slowly, but really you see that develop, that richness and that intensity in the brandies that you gain with time. So the other process, that process of dilution over a long period of time, allows us to have the brandies age over the entire spectrum of chemistry that they could age, right? So we don't hold them at high proof and then dilute them down. We don't dilute them down fast and then age them at lower proof. We bring them down slowly, but we do age them at lower proof for a considerable period of time because the nose of a brandy tends to evolve a little bit more. It's more precocious. It evolves a little bit faster, but the mouth and the structure of a brandy takes a lot more time to develop. That softness and that sort of very supple mouthfeel that really, I think, sets great brandies apart from whiskeys. Whiskeys tend to be about intensity and boldness, and I like that. They're usually more narrow in flavor profile. So one like a Scotch whiskey from Islay is like very different than one from the Spey or from the Highlands. Very different, distinctly different. Whereas brandies, we're looking for complexity, and so there's more commonality. Like if you have, ultimately complex things, then they have pieces of everything, right? And so they share more commonality. We also look for not this boldness and structure in the mouth, but a supple, harmonious structure in the mouth. And that takes a long time to develop, and it develops mostly at the lower proofs. Like you really need a long time of aging at the lower proof. So if you have a very old brandy, like something like I just use Louis XIII as an example because everybody kind of knows what it is, right? But there you would be holding that brandy, if it went into barrel at 70%, right? And we wouldn't even necessarily dilute it down to like a 64% entry proof early on, because we know it's going to go for 100 years. So it might start at 70, and just over time, over its life, it comes down in proof and down in proof, just due to natural aging. And by the time we're 80, 90, 100 years old, we're down at 40% already. And so it naturally ages over that cycle. But these brandies that are going to come out younger than that, 14, 20 years. Like they're not going to get there from 70 to 40 over that time span. And the mouth of the brandies really develop much more suppleness, below about, let's say, 42%. And so they need to spend a lot of time there. So even brandies that are bottled, at 43, 45, not so much eau de vie, but the brown spirits that are bottled, even at those higher proofs, they still have that kind of very angular mouth structure. They have some other characteristics which are nice, but that suppleness in the mouth that doesn't develop yet.
But one of the main questions I got on the feed when we set up this interview was, why is everything bottled at 40%? Because all of your products are bottled right at 40%, right? So
yeah. So my name drop. I've been told like that, our brandies would be a lot more marketable if we it could be 40.1. Just put an extra decimal place there. Everyone will love it more, because it'll look. So there's a reason why it's 40%. And one of them is stylistic and one of them is economic. So let's go to the good reason first and then go to the bad reason second. The good reason is that brandies are most aromatic. If you had to throw a dart and say, where are they most aromatic? It's at 40%. It's not always 40%, frankly. Some brandies are a little nicer at 41. Some are nicer at 38, but guess what? They're not legally brandy. So it can't go any lower than 40%. That's a hard lower boundary. And if it gets much higher than that, frankly, they're not as aromatic and they're not as supple in the mouth and they don't have as much finesse in the mouth. So now for the bad reason, if you have to print labels ahead of time, and if you're a small company, then you have to choose a number ahead of time, the TTP. If I were going to hand label every bottle, I could actually bottle, exactly on, and we do have a special approved label for small lots, for small rare lots where we actually do bottle like where we think it's most perfect. Can't be lower than 40, but maybe it's like 40.3 or 40.4 or even 41, but much above 42, and you start to lose that suppleness. So it's always going to be down there. And frankly, 40 is not really, a bad place. The brandies really, really drink well. And if you came here and you visited and we tasted those brandies all along, you would all throughout that maturation cycle where we're bringing the brandies down, and you would say, wow, yeah, it's getting better. It's getting better. And one of the reasons is this, right? Because so we didn't really talk about during the distillation cycle, but the reason why the Charente still is so elegant is that it allows for the lengthening of the fractionation process in the distillation. So that means that different types of elements can be gotten and put different places. So the first thing that comes off the Charente still is I know we're talking about blending and aging, but this feeds right back into it. The first thing that comes off the Charente stills are either the lowest boiling points, the elements with the lowest boiling points, or the elements with the greatest affinity for for alcohol, because the vapors coming off at first are alcoholic. So if there's a chemical element that doesn't like to be in a non-polar solvent, it doesn't like to be in alcohol, it would rather be in water. One we commonly know about, sugar, right? You take sugar and you put it in 95% alcohol or 70% alcohol, it's going to sit there. It's not going to dissolve. It's not soluble in a non-polar solvent. Put it in water, it goes right in, right? So if you want to get sugar in brandies, you're not going to get it by putting spirits in barrels at very high proof, right? So, and at the end of the distillation cycle, the very, very tails, right, come across components that have very high boiling points and very high affinities for water, because that's all that's left in the still, and the vapor is mostly water. So now we get across other types of elements, like furfural, right? And we want all of those. When we're building complexity in the brandy, we want all of those. Now, when you So that's why we don't throw away anything. That's why we recycle things, because we can enhance certain aspects and cut away. So the distillation process is producing in the brandies the widest spectrum of flavor compounds, if you will. And then the maturation process is all going there. Now, when it comes time to actually drink spirits or drink brandies, right, those same physical properties come back into play in the liquid, right? So those compounds that like to be in alcohol, that are happy to be in the liquid phase in alcohol, they don't go into the vapor phase. So when you smell a brandy and it's at very high proof, many of the congeners, many of the aromatic compounds are super happy to stay in the liquid phase. And so the nose is very simple, and you don't really get the full expression of the brandy. But as you put more water in there, so most people think of it as dilution. But in the early phases of adding water, you're not really diluting as much as you're enhancing. You're making it uncomfortable for those molecules to stay in the liquid phase. And so their volatility goes up. So as their volatility goes up, the brandies become more aromatic and more aromatic. So if you were to plot that, the aromatic qualities of the brandy versus the addition of water, it goes up in the initial part. And then if I just keep adding water in the limit, right? If I just keep dumping water in and dumping water in, now I'm diluting. Now I'm absolutely diluting the aromatic compounds that were there. But if you were to plot that curve, the peak in the aromaticity of those brandies is about 40%. That's where we get the most effect out of pushing those compounds up into the nose, into the glass, and actually not doing too much dilution to the brandies. So it's really kind of poorly understood. Now, so a lot of people feel that it's somehow cheating, but I personally, that's what I drink. That's what I prefer to drink. It's not like, oh, the brandies in my house, I would think, I take those from barrel samples here. We put them in the house. They're all at like 45 or 47%. The stuff I sell, we sell at 40% because we get more money from it. No. I only drink the ones that, and sometimes even the old barrels that are below 40% are gorgeous. Now, we can't sell them. It's illegal to sell. It's got to come up to 40% before I can bottle it. But they are very pretty and very round and soft in the mouth. So, I think what we lack sometimes, one, Cognac and Armagnac, they've always sort of enjoyed the mystery of the process and kept it kind of a secret. And that's kind of been a benefit for years, but I think now consumers want to really understand more and more about how these things are made. And they are so much thought and so much knowledge over the centuries has gone into developing these techniques. It's a shame that they don't speak more openly about all the techniques that are used. And so I think sometimes you get this sort of, conspiracy theory sense that some of the reasons why it's done is more economical and not really stylistic. But 40% is a great place. If you, as I said, if you have to throw a dart, that's where I want to be.
Other than water, is there anything else you add to your brandies, boisé or sugar or anything like that? Caramel?
No, not now. I do have sugar aging and I do have boisés aging. The oldest boisés I have are they're 30, 40 years old, but they're not, they're super valuable. So I'm not using them yet. I will start using them in the coming years, I think, pretty soon. The youngest boisés I have are 15, but we're constantly making young boisés. Syrup has been aging now for about 20 years. I'm a strong fan of boisés and syrup. I don't have a preference of use it or not use it. I love both. If it's a great brandy and it doesn't have syrup or boisé in it, it's a great brandy. If it's a great brandy and it does have syrup and boisé in it, it's a great brandy. There's no either or. Now, the problem has been that the marketplace doesn't really understand the development and use of those materials. So I've never been able to, I'm not there, right, when people are, look, Nicholas Palazzi is a good friend, and I really respect everything he's done for the industry. He's done a lot for brandy in the United States. You know, there are a couple like heroes. I mean, Charles Neal is absolutely, you know, a friend, a colleague, and a hero. You know, Nicholas has worked hard to promote brandies. You know, he and I, and Joe Herron too. Like Joe Herron and I, we argue because it's fun to argue. And Nicholas and I sometimes, you know, just see differently about these kinds of things. You know, but with all due respect, you know, I totally understand where he's coming from in terms of the purity of brandies that don't have boisés or syrups in them. I, on the other hand, when somebody's spending the time, I've tasted boisés, 100-year-old boisés, unbelievable rancio in that, unbelievable character in those things. They're liquid gold. I don't see those as a cheat. When somebody ages boisé for 100 years, I don't consider that to be a cheat. I you know, have got, for over the decades, I will say, over the decades, I've had this conversation with some of my colleagues on the retail side, some very famous ones here in California that you guys know well, and they've absolutely not been a fan of it. But recently, they've had an epiphany. And I think it's not anything. It's just spending more time with people who do it like with artistry, and understanding how that works, you know. And I recently read a piece on a blog, you know, about just these things that really placed it, I think, in the proper context of how and why one would want to use them in that way. So, because I can't be present at every sale to defend the use of boisé and to defend the use of syrup, I was afraid to include it in the products because I thought that the marketplace was so averse to those techniques that I would sell less brandy than I do now, and you know, that would be like a stain on our reputation. But and at the same time, I wanted to build products here in house that had the maturity and had the age to really feel good about utilizing. So the boisés we have now are reaching that stage where I think, you know, it will be exciting to begin to bring them into some of those blends, using a little bit of syrup, you know, early on to round out, you know, old aged syrup. I think will be interesting. And I at some point in the near future, I mean, I don't know, this year, next year, 5 years, I absolutely will do that. The boisés, I would say, will go into our higher end products. It's, you know, after decades and decades of aging boisé, it's not a cheap thing. And boisé, why would you use boisé? Like, why wouldn't you just age brandy? It goes back to the same argument that we were making in terms of the still, in terms of the dilution, in terms of the way chemical compounds age. Boisé is classically produced from water extraction of untoasted oak. So untoasted oak extracted with water. As I said earlier, if you drop a sugar cube in 65% alcohol, it ain't going nowhere. So if you put 65% alcohol in an oak barrel and there are natural sugars from the oak that have caramelized, from the toasting, caramelized sugars, all those wonderful flavors are not going into the brandy. They're not soluble. They're not soluble until you get to lower and lower alcohol contents. Then those sugary compounds, as others as well, become soluble in the liquid. So by utilizing the old cooperage, by rotating the cooperage in and bringing the brandies down, we're able to extract at different periods of time compounds that were left behind by earlier evolutions of the earlier brandies in those same barrels. It's not like they're spent barrels. They're only spent for the processes that we were using them for in the beginning. They still have a lot to give us in the back end, right? And in the same way, by using water extracted, untoasted oak, we are able to extract chemical compounds from the oak that can't be extracted from brandies because we never get down to pure water. And by then bringing those boisés up in alcohol to preserve them and age them, they take on a character that you can't get by simply aging brandy in oak barrels. You get a completely different flavor of brandy from them. And it's wonderful. I mean, it's amazing. If you came here and I showed you some of these things, and it produces a style of brandy that you can't get another way. If you like it, I do, then you have to do it that way. And in the hands of an artist, it's amazing, right? I like to say, like, by saying, I will never use boisé, I will never use syrup, and I will never use caramel color. It's like asking a painter, and you can talk about caramel color too, which I don't use, but I have no aversion to it whatsoever. It's like telling a painter you can only use blue. Now, Picasso did a great job in one period of his career using only blue. So it can be done, no problem, I understand that. But give him the full palette and you get a different type of painting, right? And you can't say his blue period is better or worse than another period, right? But they are different. They are different. And so I like both, frankly. Caramel color, which is used extensively in cognac, the number one caramel producer in cognac is a small family operation, frankly, and most all of them are. And up until just a few years ago, it was handmade by one guy in a copper pot over an open flame. And it came pure cane sugar syrup from obviously the French Caribbean, came over and they caramelized it. It was a perfectly natural ingredient, tasteless, colorless. And when used with efficacy in the hands of an artist, I think it can bring, because we taste as much with our eyes as we do with our mouth. We know scientifically that if we change the color of things, our physical sensation on our tongue changes. And so when you taste a brandy that has maybe it's one shade of color, and you put caramel color in it and make it another shade of color, you actually will taste it differently. Look, if you take 2-year-old brandy and you throw brand new boisé, brand new sugar syrup, brand new caramel color in there, and throw it out and say, yeah, that's being a pig, right? But if you have a brandy, like, and some producers do that, like they feel a little bit of color addition makes it drink better. If it's wonderful, I'm fine drinking it, you know? And if it's got a little bit of sweetness in it, yeah, many brandies I find are overly sweet for me. Many cognacs are overly sweet for me. That's too much, but it's not something inherently bad in adding sugar to brandy. So aside from caramel color, which we don't have, but the other key ingredients, the boisés and the syrups, we do have, and I hope in the future to make some bottlings with them. Pétilloux, the feb, you know, the key ingredient, one of the harder ones to make, right? So those dilutions in the end. So when you're adding water early on in the process, it's not really diluting at all, really, not at all. Why? Because it's going back into barrel for another 20 years. And that water is participating in chemical reactions that are producing flavor compounds that give brandies this great length and great elegance. Now, if right before bottling, you dilute down the brandies to get them into bottle at 40%, that is dilution because you're not putting it back in barrel. Those components are not aging together. So that's dilution, right? So I say, you know, the worst thing to do to a brown spirit is to put it up at high proof in a barrel, hold it for whatever period of time, drop it down to whatever drinking proof you want, and bottle it. That's the worst thing to do. The second, you know, worst thing to do, frankly, is hold it at high proof its whole life and just bottle it that way, because you really haven't let the spirit fully develop. And that goes for, in my mind, for all spirits, frankly, all brown spirits. The best way is to achieve the bottling proof that you want to see for that product that you feel is the most harmonious and gives you the most benefit for the spirit, to achieve that over the entire length of time that you have available to you, right? So if it's a 2-year-old product, it's 2 years. If it's a 8-year-old product, it's 8 years. If it's a 15-year-old product, it's 15 years. So that is the best way. But at the end, you still have to hit that label number, right? Unless you're going to handwrite in everything by analysis. And the best way to do that, the way that actually enhances the brandy instead of dilutes the brandy, is that those last small additions are done with something that we call fève or pétillots. It's essentially water that's been aged with enough brandy to keep it biologically stable, usually at about 18%, 20% alcohol, that's aged as long as the brandies you're putting it in. So I have I have Pétillots going back, from the beginning of not quite, because I wasn't smart enough to actually make it, as some of my colleagues, my smarter colleagues told me that's the first thing you should make is Feb. What am I going to do with 20%? I can't sell it. No, if you're a wise man, the first thing you do is, and I wasn't a wise man. Now I wish I had it. But the XO, the last pieces of the dilution are done with Pétillots that's as old as the youngest brandies. So you're really not diluting it in that sense. So I think a detailed understanding of the real classic processes and the rationale behind how and why they're used just leads to a really greater appreciation, I think, for all these things, rather than thinking of them as cheats. I'm going to shut this door. So that's why we have a lot of those things. We use a lot of these techniques, and it's the type of thing where when people come visit and we can spend the time to sort of go through the Shea, taste different things, it's a lot easier to sort of see, But I do think that, especially people that are brandy aficionados, you see it, you taste it every day in the products that that you enjoy. Like, and no. I mean, I wish that it was a two-way conversation, and I could ask people, like, what do you think about these things? Like, what do you like in cognac? What do you like in Armagnac? Do you find some of these classic techniques appalling, or do you find them interesting? Are you just averse to them from a sort of philosophical perspective, or have you tasted brandies that have been produced in both different methods? And for me, it's interesting to actually learn that as well, because I kind of exist in a bubble, in this distillery. And when well, except for this year, I'm always in France a few times a year, both for our wood buying and also to meet with colleagues and, to just really understand. Because for me, it's a lifetime learning process to really understand the full development of great brandies. And I mean, they're the only brown spirit which really do develop positively over the life scale of a human, right? Like 100 years, Grand Champagne, 100 years can do it, right? Not too many whiskeys go 100 years and still can say they're the better for it. Not too many whiskeys can go 40 years and say they're the better for it. Some, for sure, but most brandies can go 40 years and say they're the better for it. Many whiskeys, you'd say the sweet spot is what, 12 to 24 years? Many brandies are not even hitting maturity till, like 24 years. They're youthful. That's beautiful brandies, beautiful young youthful brandies. But when you want to talk about a mature one, so brandy is unique in that way, that it ages and develops kind of on our lifespan, which honestly means that it takes kind of a lifespan to understand it, from a standpoint of a producer.
When you talk about the boisés and the sugars being aged, are they aging in oak casks the same way Brandy does? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
So Dan, this has been remarkable, and I thank you. This has been a lot of fun. I want to, before we go, I do want to ask you, because you did show us the Armagnac still, when can we expect those Donfontes style Calvados and Armagnac style brandies to be bottled from you? How long is that going to take?
Well, that's a good question. Our first commercial distillation in that still. So we had it for 2 years before, but we installed it right when we sort of shut down. So our first commercial distillation using the Armagnac still was last year, and we will also have distillation this year. Actually, last year we only distilled in that still. This year we'll start back up with both stills. And unfortunately, to some extent, that still produces a brandy that takes longer to mature than the Charente still. So even in Armagnac, if they want Armagnac to come out younger, they will include Charente-derived distillate in those more precocious brandies. But, I haven't really decided one way or the other yet. There's something to be said, I think, for the Bruichladdich approach of saying, like, join us in the journey, right? Like, if we're going to bottle this once, and it's not really, but if you want to taste what, really young Bruichladdich tastes like, we'll, as our reopening of the distillery, as these things mature, we'll kind of, make some small releases. And I haven't decided yet whether that will be the case. Now, Brandy does have this kind of funky stage for a couple of years at least, where it's just not pleasant to drink. And then, usually you have to have intent of where the brandy is going so that you can do all those things I just talked about in terms of dilution, right? So, or you release it at cask strength, which I just said wasn't a great idea either. So I have to kind of figure out like some sort of sweet spot to where maybe we can get some of these things out to people that are really interested in kind of understanding them, but they're not intended to be, I would say, enjoyed in the same way as a really mature spirit. But I know there's people out there that are interested in kind of having them to understand, and learn about the evolution of brandy. So I may use it as an opportunity, excuse me, to do that, to release some very limited bottlings that are really only for people that want to understand how these things evolve and are not intended for really to be consumed in the same way. So I'm thinking about that. I didn't answer your question specifically, but I tried to answer philosophically how we approach it.
And are there other things? I mean, you've been very, as you said, you've got 4 bottlings. You pretty much stick to those. Are there other new things you might see, or is that your plan for now to keep on with those 4?
That's really the plan, to keep on with those 4. We will obviously add those other Armagnac things coming from the Armagnac still. It may be that with the new fruit coming on, that we can do some things a little differently, in the sense that maybe, and I've thought about this, like we can do some blends that are a little more focused on like absolutely unique California varietals, because Pinot Noir, I think, is one of the ones that's truly noble in the sense that you could actually make a single varietal out of it, and it does have structure and it does have finesse. Uni Blanc obviously can do that. Colombard can do that to some extent. We don't know about Folignon. We have the only Folignon vineyard in the United States. Montiel, we have the only Montiel vineyard in the United States. Some of those we may be able to produce like a Montiel Faux Blanche, sort of classic blend, and a Pinot Noir, Riesling, bit of Viognier, California blend. So we may be able now to kind of branch out a little bit over the coming years, but at least with the stocks we have presently, that will be the ones that will be releasing for the next, I would say, 5 years or so. They'll be really in those sort of similar styles. Now they're changing. Like I just spent you know, the winter, reblending the rare, reblending up the XO, and you know, those are coming from different vintages now. And so those blends are changing every year, to some degree, pretty significantly. Like the rare blend that's going to be released later this year, pretty significantly different. The previous blend that's in the market today was a style I made, a much lighter style, a much more youthful oaky style. The next rare blend is going to be a bit older, frankly, a bit more of a more classic European VSOP style, you know. So it will be significantly different. It will have the same label, but it will be a very different brandy. We're fortunate that, you know, if you're a small company, you don't have to worry about perfect consistency. It wouldn't be something I would want to achieve. You know, what I want to achieve is continuous quality, right? I wouldn't want to ever see the quality go down, but the characteristics can change a little bit, you know, from blending to blending.
Great. Well, Dan, thank you very much for spending your time with us. It's been fantastic.
Thank you, guys. I really like what you're doing, and it's an honest pleasure to be able to speak, even in sort of cyberspace, to a group of people who are rare indeed. I mean, people that love brandy are few and far between, and I really enjoy being able to actually just show what we do here to people that have a passion for spirits made from fruit. So thank you.
We appreciate it, especially appreciate you taking us into the tour of the still. So thanks for that.
One of these days, we can do this out in the vineyard again, and we can go look at vines someday.
That'd be fun too. All right. Thanks very much, Dan.
Thanks.